There is an island in the Mississippi River, 946 acres of limestone and brick, wedged between Davenport, Iowa, and Rock Island, Illinois. For 163 years, it was the largest government-owned manufacturing complex in the American interior. The weapons forged here armed Union soldiers, doughboys, GIs, and the men who walked the mountains of Afghanistan. At its height, 20,000 workers crossed the bridges every morning. Today, the stone shops still stand, but most of them are quiet. How does a federal arsenal lose the reason it was built? As we uncover the full story of its dramatic rise and fiery fall, I want to hear from you. Which legendary company or forgotten factory should we investigate next? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. And if you love stories of industrial empires, brilliant innovations, and the fateful decisions that changed history, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming. Before it was an arsenal, it was a home. The island that now carries the weight of 163 years of American war-making sat in the Mississippi River long before there was a United States to claim it. The Sauk and Meskwaki knew it as Rock Island. The river split around it. The current slowed on its western shore. The cottonwoods grew thick along the banks. For generations, their people had gathered here to trade, to fish, to bury their dead. The island was sacred ground in a way that no stone building would ever replicate. Then the Americans came. In 1816, 4 years after the end of the War of 1812, the United States Army established Fort Armstrong on the southwestern tip of the island. The fort was built of squared timber, blockhouses at the corners, stockade walls facing the river. The purpose was straightforward: hold the upper Mississippi, watch the British-leaning tribes to the north, project federal authority into a frontier that had not yet decided whether it belonged to Washington or to someone else. 3 companies of infantry at most. But it was the first permanent claim the federal government ever made on this island, and it was the beginning of everything that followed. Fort Armstrong sat directly on land the Sauk Nation had never ceded. The 1804 Treaty of St. Louis, which American negotiators claimed gave them title to the region, had been signed by a handful of Sauk representatives who had no authority to speak for the nation. The terms were disputed from the day the ink dried. The chief who would spend his life contesting that treaty was a warrior named Makatai Mishikiakiak. History remembers him by the English translation of his name, the Black Hawk. Black Hawk was born on this island around 1767. His village, Saukenuk, stood at the mouth of the Rock River a few miles south. He watched Fort Armstrong rise on ground his people had walked for 100 years. He watched American settlers cross the river into territory his nation still considered its own. He watched the soldiers come and go, and he watched the federal presence harden with each passing season. For 16 years, he waited. In 1832, he crossed back east of the Mississippi with roughly 1,000 followers to reclaim the land. The war that followed lasted 15 weeks. The Black Hawk War was brutal, one-sided, and brief. American militia and regular Army units pursued the Sauk through Illinois and Wisconsin. The final engagement, the Battle of Bad Axe, was less a battle than a massacre. Black Hawk surrendered in August 1832 and was imprisoned at Fortress Monroe in Virginia. He died in 1838 in what is now Iowa, buried in a seated position according to his people's custom. His remains were later stolen and put on display in a museum. The island of his birth became federal property, permanently and without ambiguity. The Army decommissioned Fort Armstrong in 1836, its mission completed. The arsenal that would arm America for the next century and a half was built on land taken from a people who had been driven west at gunpoint. The surveyors knew it. The engineers who laid out the first shop foundations knew it. They built anyway. The island sat mostly quiet for the next 3 decades, a few federal caretakers, a small depot for Army supplies. The old fort's timbers rotted into the riverbank. Then the country tore itself in half, and the Rock Island in the Mississippi became useful again in a way nobody had anticipated. In July 1862, with the Civil War in its second year and Union prisoner of war facilities overflowing, Congress passed legislation authorizing the establishment of a major federal arsenal on the island. The measure moved quickly through both chambers. President Lincoln signed it the same month. The logic was geographic. The island sat at a strategic river crossing, far enough from any Confederate raiding range to be safe, close enough to the industrial capacity of Chicago and St. Louis to be useful. An arsenal here could arm the Union's Western armies without depending on the eastern seaboard. But before the arsenal could rise, the island had another job to do first. In December 1863, the U.S. Army began construction of a prisoner of war camp on the northwestern portion of the island. The compound consisted of 84 wooden barracks arranged in rows, surrounded by a 12-foot fence with guard towers at the corners. It was built to hold 10,000 Confederate prisoners. Within weeks of opening, it held more. The prisoners arrived in December of that year, sick and underfed, before they ever reached the island. Many of them captured at the Battle of Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge in Tennessee. They came by train to the west bank of the Mississippi and crossed the ice on foot in temperatures that dropped below zero. Smallpox traveled with them. Within the first month, the disease was killing prisoners at a rate of more than a dozen a day. The camp hospital was inadequate. The rations were thin. The Illinois winter was merciless. By the time the war ended 18 months later, 1,964 Confederate soldiers had died on the island and been buried in the grounds at the northern end. 1,964 young men. Picture this. January 1864. The island covered in snow a foot deep. A line of Confederate prisoners shuffling across the frozen compound toward the mess hall, their shoes wrapped in rags, their overcoats thin enough to see the light through. The wind coming down the Mississippi Valley cutting through wool and cotton alike. The smell of coal smoke and chloride of lime from the smallpox ward. A burial detail working in the frozen earth at the north end of the camp, trying to dig graves in ground so hard the pickaxes ring like bells against it. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of hammers. Federal carpenters. On the other side of the island, beginning the first construction surveys for the arsenal that would rise here after the war. The Confederate cemetery still exists. The graves are marked. The numbers are not in dispute. Young men from Alabama and Georgia and Tennessee and Mississippi, buried on an island thousands of miles from home, under soil that had been taken from the Sauk 50 years before. The arsenal's founding was layered on top of two separate acts of grief, and the buildings that would rise in the decades to come carried that foundation whether anyone spoke about it or not. When the war ended in April 1865, the prison camp was decommissioned. The last prisoners were released or transferred. The barracks were dismantled. The fences came down. The guard towers were torn out. What remained was a federal reservation of 946 acres, a cemetery full of Confederate dead, and a congressional mandate to build an arsenal. The man who would build it had already been chosen. His name was Thomas Jackson Rodman, and he was a believer. He believed in iron. He believed in mathematics. He believed that a cannon barrel cast in a hollow mold and cooled from the inside would be stronger than any gun forged by the old methods. He had spent decades proving it, developing what became known as the Rodman process, a technique for producing heavy artillery that could withstand pressures other guns could not. By the time the Civil War ended, the largest cannons in the Union arsenal were Rodman guns, some of them firing 20-inch shells that weighed over 1,000 pounds each. The man knew iron the way a composer knows a key. He also believed in permanence. Rodman arrived at the Rock Island Arsenal in 1865, 50 years old, a career ordnance officer with the rank of lieutenant colonel. Carrying the plans he had been drawing up in his head for most of a decade. Congress had appropriated funds for an arsenal. Congress had not specified what that arsenal should look like. That was left to him. He stood on the island that first summer after the war, walked the ground from the Confederate cemetery at the north end to the old Fort Armstrong site at the south, and decided that whatever he built here would still be standing in 1,000 years. Rodman wasn't a visionary in the showy sense. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't trying to build a monument to himself. He was an artillery officer who had watched the Union struggle to arm itself during 4 years of total war, watched private contractors deliver inconsistent weapons at inconsistent prices, watched the government's own arsenal at Springfield strain past its limits. He had concluded that the country needed a federal manufacturing complex in the interior that could not be reached by any foreseeable enemy and could not be compromised by any private interest. He intended to build it out of stone, and he intended to build it to last. His plan called for 10 massive manufacturing buildings arranged in 2 parallel rows running east to west along the island's central spine. Each building would be nearly identical in dimensions. Each would be 3 stories tall, constructed of limestone quarried within a day's haul of the site, with walls thick enough to withstand artillery fire. Each would measure roughly 320 feet long by 80 feet wide, set on foundations that went down to bedrock. The total floor space, when completed, would exceed 2 million square feet. It was the largest single construction project the United States government had ever attempted outside of the Capitol itself. A federal officer, working with congressional appropriations that had to be renegotiated year after year. Planning a manufacturing complex larger than the Capitol building, on an island in the middle of a river, 2,000 miles from Washington. Construction began in 1867. The first limestone blocks were cut from quarries in nearby LeClaire, Iowa, and hauled to the island by barge. The masons who laid them were recruited from across the Midwest, many of them Irish and German immigrants who had arrived in the decade before the war. They worked from dawn to dusk, 6 days a week through summers that baked the river valley and winters that froze it solid. A stone wall rose, then a second, then a floor, then a roof, then the next building beside it. Rodman did not live to see it finished. He died in June 1871, 6 years into the construction project. With only 2 of the 10 shops completed, he was buried at the Arsenal's Post Cemetery on the island he had given his final years to building. The work continued without him. His deputies followed his plans with the kind of devotion you rarely see in federal construction. The buildings rose exactly as he had drawn them. Shop A, Shop B, Shop C, each one a twin of the last, each one locking the complex into its final form. By 1893, the 10th and final building was complete. 26 years of continuous construction, a stone city on an island in the Mississippi. Picture this. Summer, 1889. A visiting congressman from Ohio steps off the ferry and walks up the path toward the Arsenal compound. The heat of the river is in the air. He rounds a stand of oak trees and stops. In front of him, stretching in 2 perfect parallel rows toward the horizon, are 8 completed limestone shops, with 2 more under construction. The walls are pale gray in the summer light. Iron shutters hang at every window. Freight wagons move between the buildings carrying raw steel and finished components. A whistle sounds somewhere, and a line of workers in leather aprons crosses the open ground between Shop C and Shop D. The congressman has seen the Capitol. He has seen the Treasury. He has never seen anything like this. He stands there for a long minute, and then he takes his hat off. The arsenal was not just producing weapons. It was producing the infrastructure of a military supply system that the country had never had before. Wagons and harnesses, haversacks and cartridge boxes, saddles and field kitchens, tools, spare parts. The Ordnance Department had decided early on that Rock Island would be a general-purpose arsenal, capable of manufacturing or repairing virtually any piece of equipment an army in the field might need. The shops were laid out accordingly: one building for small arms, one for artillery components, one for leather goods, one for iron castings. Each shop specialized, each shop feeding into the larger whole. By 1875, the arsenal employed roughly 300 civilian workers. By 1890, the number had grown to 800. The workforce was overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly white, drawn from the surrounding communities of Davenport, Rock Island, and Moline. Many of them were the sons of the masons who had laid the foundations. Multi-generational employment was already beginning to define the complex, in ways that nobody in Washington was paying much attention to, but that everyone on the island understood. The first major production runs were modest by later standards: infantry rifles, sabers for cavalry units, gun carriages for coastal artillery batteries. The small arms work at Rock Island supplemented what Springfield Armory was producing back east, and the two installations developed a working relationship that would last for the rest of the 19th century. Springfield designed, Rock Island produced at scale. The division of labor was never formal, but it was consistent, and it worked. While the country was still recovering from the Civil War, still fighting the Indian Wars on the Western Plains, and still debating how much of a standing army a democratic republic could safely afford, an arsenal was rising in the Mississippi River that could, if fully mobilized, arm every soldier the United States had ever fielded in its history. That was the scale Rodman had built for. The country had not yet understood what it had. The Spanish-American War in 1898 gave the arsenal its first real test as a modern production facility. The conflict was brief, barely 4 months from declaration to armistice, but it pulled Rock Island's output up sharply for the first time since the Civil War ended. Rifles, ammunition boxes, field equipment, all of it flowed out of the arsenal in quantities the complex had been built for but had not yet been asked to produce. The workforce nearly doubled during the mobilization. By 1899, and the arsenal employed almost 1,500 men. The shops ran longer shifts. The railroad sidings that had been laid to move materials into the complex were running more freight cars than they had since the construction era. For the first time since Rodman's plans had been drawn on paper in 1865, the buildings were being used the way he had imagined them. The war ended. The workforce shrank again. The pattern that would define the next century of Rock Island's existence had revealed itself for the first time. And nobody on the island yet understood what it meant. The pattern would repeat itself over the next 15 years with quiet consistency. Surge and contract, hire and lay off. Run 3 shifts during crisis, run 1 during peace. The arsenal's workforce climbed back up past 1,200 during the build-up to the Mexican border crisis in 1916, when Pancho Villa's raid on Columbus, New Mexico sent General Pershing into Mexico with 5,000 men and thousands of fresh requisitions flowing into Rock Island. The shops produced field equipment, wagon components, artillery parts, cavalry gear. Then Europe set itself on fire, and everything the arsenal had been doing was suddenly a rehearsal. When Woodrow Wilson signed the declaration of war against Germany on April 6, 1917, the United States Army had roughly 127,000 active soldiers. By the armistice in November 1918, 19 months later, it had over 4 million men under arms. The mobilization was the largest and fastest in American history to that point. The country's industrial base was not remotely prepared for it. The existing federal arsenals at Springfield, Watertown, Frankfort, Watervliet, and Rock Island were asked to ramp up production by orders of magnitude, and they were asked to do it immediately. Rock Island ramped faster than any of them. The arsenal had 2 advantages its sister installations did not. The first was scale. Rodman's 10-shop complex, built for exactly this kind of emergency, had more floor space than any other federal manufacturing facility in the country. The second was geography. The island sat at the center of the American interior, with rail lines connecting it to Chicago, St. Louis, and Minneapolis, and a major river running past its doorstep. Raw steel could arrive by barge. Finished products could ship by rail in every direction. The logistics that had seemed excessive in 1867 looked visionary in 1917. The workforce numbers tell the story. In January 1917, before American entry into the war, the arsenal employed roughly 1,700 men and women. By the end of that year, the number had tripled. By summer 1918, employment had reached 13,000. At peak mobilization in the autumn of that year, the arsenal employed over 15,000 civilian workers across 3 continuous shifts, and the shops were running 24 hours a day, 6 days a week, with a skeleton crew holding position on Sundays to keep the furnaces hot. A significant portion of the new workforce was female. With so many men drafted into service or hired away by private war contractors, the arsenal opened entire shops to women for the first time in its history. They operated lathes. They assembled harness components. They ran the ammunition packing lines. In 1918, roughly 3,000 women were employed at Rock Island, and in some buildings they outnumbered male workers 2 to 1. Most of them had never worked an industrial job before. Most of them learned what they needed to learn in a matter of weeks. The products that came out of the arsenal during the First World War defined American military equipment for a generation. Rock Island produced roughly 86,000 of the M1917 Enfield rifles, the bolt-action weapon that armed most of the American expeditionary forces in Europe. The rifle itself had been designed in Britain and adapted for American .30 caliber ammunition. Rock Island machinists produced the components, assembled the rifles, and shipped them east at a pace that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. But the signature contribution of Rock Island during the First World War was not a rifle. It was a machine gun. The Browning automatic rifle, known universally as the Bar, was designed by John Moses Browning in 1917. Browning was already the most prolific firearms designer in American history. His work had defined Winchester's lever-action rifles, Colt's semi-automatic pistols, and the heavy machine guns that American forces would carry into 2 world wars. The Bar was his attempt to solve a tactical problem that the Great War had exposed. Infantry needed portable automatic firepower. Something a single soldier could carry forward across a battlefield and used to suppress enemy positions while his squad advanced. Browning demonstrated the prototype to Army ordnance officers in February 1917. They were impressed immediately. The weapon fired the same .30 caliber ammunition as the M1917 rifle. It weighed under 16 pounds empty. It could be fired from the shoulder, the hip, or a bipod, and it cycled at roughly 550 rounds per minute. The Army ordered it into production that summer. Rock Island Arsenal was one of 3 manufacturers selected to produce the Bar, alongside Colt and Winchester. The Arsenal retooled shops, hired additional workers, trained them on the complex machining tolerances the weapon required, and began production in 1918. The first Bars reached American troops in France in July of that year, just 4 months before the armistice. They saw limited combat before the war ended, but the weapon's reputation was established. It would remain in American military service for the next 50 years, carried by infantry squads through the Second World War, Korea, and into Vietnam. A weapon first produced at Rock Island in 1918 was still being carried by American soldiers in jungle firefights in 1968. Half a century of continuous military service. And it was designed to shoot straight and built to last because the machinists who assembled the first ones in the limestone shops of the arsenal knew what they were doing. Late summer 1918. Shop D at the Rock Island Arsenal. The great windows along both long walls are open to catch whatever breeze can make it up off the river. The shop floor is nearly 100 yards long. And every 20 feet along its length there is a lathe or a milling machine, each one manned by a worker in coveralls and a leather apron. The air smells of cutting oil and hot steel. The noise is constant, a mechanical roar that has not stopped since the night shift came on at 11 the previous evening. A foreman walks the center aisle carrying a clipboard. He pauses at each station, glances at the work, and moves on. At the far end of the shop, a line of finished bar receivers is being loaded onto flat carts for transport to the assembly building. The arsenal produced roughly 16,000 bars during the war, and thousands more in the years immediately after. And the institutional knowledge of how to build them stayed on the island long after the contracts ended, while the shops were running at capacity. Yes, the communities around the island were transforming. Davenport, Rock Island, and Moline had always been river towns, shaped by barge traffic and lumber mills and farm implement factories. But the arsenal's wartime boom pulled them into a different orbit entirely. Thousands of new workers needed housing. Streetcar lines extended to accommodate them. Boarding houses opened in converted warehouses. New neighborhoods were laid out on the outskirts of all three cities. Cheap frame houses built quickly for men and women who crossed the government bridge onto the island 6 days a week. The shift whistles became the sound that governed daily life. The morning whistle at 7, the lunch whistle at noon, the shift change whistle at 3, the evening whistle at 11. Within a mile of the riverbank on either shore, you could set your watch by them. Merchants opened their stores on schedules built around the arsenal shifts. Saloons filled after the afternoon whistle. Churches scheduled Wednesday evening services to accommodate workers coming off day shift and workers getting ready for night shift. The island and the three cities that flanked it were becoming a single economic organism, and nobody was going to reverse that bonding once it had formed. Then, on November 11, 1918, the gun stopped. The armistice took effect at 11 in the morning Paris time, which was 4 in the morning in the Quad Cities. By the time the day shift arrived at the arsenal gates, word had already spread across the river. The shops ran that day, but they ran differently. The urgency was gone. The foreman did not push the pace. By the end of the week, the cancellation notices began arriving from Washington. Artillery contracts canceled. Rifle contracts reduced. Bar production cut in half, and then cut again. The arsenal, which had been running at 15,000 workers the week before the armistice, was down to 8,000 by Christmas. It was the pattern, repeating itself on a scale nobody had seen before, and it was only the first time. The 1920s were the arsenal's long exhale. By 1922, the workforce had collapsed to roughly 1,200 civilian employees. 4/5 of the men and women who had clocked in during the summer of 1918 were gone. Some had found work in the farm implement factories in Moline and the meatpacking plants in Davenport. Many had left the Quad Cities entirely, heading back to the small towns they had come from when the mobilization drew them in. The arsenal shops that had run 3 shifts were running 1. Several had been mothballed entirely, their machinery covered in canvas, their windows shuttered against dust. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, signed by the major powers in an effort to prevent another global arms race, capped battleship tonnage and cruiser construction for the next decade. The Army drawdown was even more severe. By 1925, the United States Army had returned to a peacetime strength of roughly 135,000 men, barely larger than it had been before the First World War. The demand for new rifles, new artillery, new field equipment was a fraction of what Rock Island had been built to produce. The arsenal did what it had always done. It diversified. It took on repair work for existing weapon systems. It produced specialized components for other government agencies. It maintained the institutional knowledge in the shops by shifting workers through different specializations, making sure that when the next crisis arrived, there would still be men who knew how to build what needed to be built. The foreman who had trained apprentices during the war now had time to train them properly. passing down the feel of the machines in a way that production pressure never allowed. Then the stock market crashed in October 1929, and the long exhale turned into something harder. The Great Depression hit the Quad Cities the way it hit every industrial community in the country. The farm implement factories in Moline cut their workforces by half. John Deere, the region's largest private employer, laid off thousands. The meatpacking plants ran at reduced capacity. Davenport, Rock Island, and Moline all saw bankruptcies mount through 1930 and 1931. The arsenal, insulated by federal funding, held steady at first. Then the budget cuts reached the War Department, and even Rock Island began shedding jobs. By 1933, the arsenal workforce had dropped below 800, the lowest it had been since the 19th century. The buildings were still there. The machines were still there. The knowledge of how to build rifles and gun carriages and harness components was still there. What was missing was anyone willing to pay for it. Rodman stone shops, built to last 1,000 years, sat half empty on an island in the middle of a river, and the economic collapse outside their walls threatened to make them irrelevant. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal did not save the arsenal, but it bought the complex time. Public Works Administration funds financed modest renovation projects across the installation. Several of the older buildings received new roofs and upgraded electrical systems. The bridges connecting the island to Davenport and Rock Island were rebuilt with federal money. The workforce crept back up slowly through the mid-1930s. As rearmament programs began quietly expanding in response to events in Europe and Asia. By 1939, with Germany having annexed Austria and dismembered Czechoslovakia, the arsenal was employing roughly 2,700 workers. The shops were running again, though not at anything approaching wartime pace. Artillery components, small arms parts, machine gun barrels, equipment for an army that Washington was beginning to understand would need to be ready sooner than anyone had hoped. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, the arsenal's production schedules were quietly accelerated. When France fell in June 1940, they were accelerated again. By the time Japanese aircraft appeared over Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Rock Island was already running 2 shifts and hiring aggressively. But what came next dwarfed everything the arsenal had ever done. The Second World War was an industrial war on a scale the First World War had only hinted at. The United States produced more tanks, more artillery pieces, more trucks, more rifles, and more ammunition than any other nation in human history. The federal arsenals, Rock Island chief among them, were at the center of that effort. Every shop that Rodman had built was put into service. Every piece of machinery was running. 3 shifts, 6 days a week, with limited production on Sundays to meet delivery schedules that Washington kept tightening. The workforce numbers exceeded anything in the complex's history. By December 1942, the arsenal employed 15,000 workers. By 1943, the number had climbed past 18,000. At peak production in 1944, Rock Island employed over 20,000 civilian workers, and the combined payroll across the island was the largest of any federal installation in the American interior. The Quad Cities' population surged. Housing shortages became acute. Federal trailer parks were set up on vacant land in Davenport and Rock Island to house workers who could not find rooms anywhere else. The streetcar lines ran around the clock. The shift whistles became the background noise of daily life in 4 cities on both sides of the Mississippi. Picture this: March 1943. The main manufacturing building at Rock Island Arsenal. It is 2 in the afternoon, deep in the middle of day shift, and the noise hits you before anything else. Lathes spinning at 5,000 revolutions per minute. Drop hammers falling with a rhythm that rattles the steel roof trusses above. Overhead cranes carrying finished artillery recoil mechanisms from one end of the shop to the other. The air is thick with metal dust and cutting oil, and the acrid bite of cleaning solvents. Natural light pours through the tall windows along both walls, illuminating the dust so that it hangs in the air like fog. A woman at a milling machine near the center aisle pauses to wipe her forehead with the back of her leather glove. She is 23 years old, a school teacher from Bettendorf who applied for arsenal work 8 months ago because her husband is in the Pacific. She has machined over 4,000 recoil housing components since she started. She knows the feel of a properly cut surface by touch alone. She puts the glove back on and turns the next piece. The shop does not stop for her or for anyone. It has not stopped since the shift before and will not stop until the shift after. 4 cities are living on this rhythm. A war on 3 continents is being supplied by these hands. The signature production runs at Rock Island during the war defined American military equipment for the next generation. The arsenal produced hundreds of thousands of artillery recoil mechanisms, the complex hydraulic systems that absorb the backward motion of a cannon firing, allowing a heavy gun to sit on its carriage and fire repeatedly without the entire mount being destroyed. Every major field artillery piece the American military fielded during the war depended on recoil systems, and Rock Island manufactured the majority of them. The arsenal also produced components for the M1 Garand rifle, for the M1 918B AR, for machine gun mounts, for tank transmission assemblies, for wheeled gun carriages, for field kitchens, for everything an army in the field needed to fight. The government invested heavily in Rock Island during the war. New buildings went up for the first time in half a century, most of them steel and brick rather than the original limestone, tucked into the gaps between Rodman's shops. A new heat-treating facility, a new assembly plant, expanded warehousing, additional rail sidings. By 1945, the physical footprint of the installation had grown by nearly a third, and the manufacturing capacity had multiplied several times over. Let that sink in. Over 20,000 workers crossing the government bridges each day, 3 shifts running continuously for 3.5 years, the single largest federal manufacturing workforce in the American interior. All of it happening on an island that had been sacred ground to the Sauk, a prison camp to the Confederate dead, and a bureaucratic afterthought through most of the 1930s. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the war contracts began canceling within days. The arsenal workforce started shrinking almost immediately. By the end of 1946, employment had dropped back to roughly 5,000. By 1948, it was below 3,000. The pattern was repeating itself, exactly as it had after 1865 and after 1918. And the people who had lived through the earlier cycles understood what was coming. Then, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel on June 25, 1950, and the guns started firing again. The Korean War gave Rock Island one more full-scale mobilization, though on a smaller scale than the Second World War. The arsenal produced artillery components, recoil systems, small arms parts, and support equipment for American forces on the peninsula. Employment climbed back past 10,000 by 1952. The shops ran 2 shifts. The Quad Cities economy, which had been adjusting to peacetime production in the farm implement factories, surged again on federal spending. It was the last true peak. The armistice at Panmunjom in July 1953 did not trigger the kind of cliff-edge collapse that had followed the 2 world wars. The Cold War was already underway. American forces remained deployed across Europe and the Pacific. The Department of Defense, reorganized under the 1947 National Security Act, was thinking about sustained readiness in a way no previous peacetime military establishment had. The arsenal did not shed workers overnight. It shed them slowly. By 1955, employment had dropped to roughly 8,000. By 1960, it was closer to 6,000. The shops were running 1 shift, with selective overtime when specific contracts required it. Through the 1950s and early 1960s, Rock Island settled into what looked like a new equilibrium. The workforce held steady. The core mission evolved. The arsenal became the Army's primary center for the manufacture and overhaul of artillery weapons, armored vehicle components, and specialized military hardware. Gun carriages, recoil mechanisms, tank gun tubes, howitzer components, the kind of heavy precision work that required the institutional knowledge that only a federal arsenal could sustain. The Vietnam War, when it came, arrived differently than the earlier conflicts. There was no declaration. There was no national mobilization. The ramp-up was gradual, beginning with small advisory deployments in 1961 and growing into a major combat commitment by 1965. The arsenal's production schedules responded accordingly. Employment climbed back to roughly 9,000 by 1968, the peak year of American involvement in Southeast Asia. Rock Island produced artillery pieces for the 105mm and 155mm howitzers that American forces used extensively in Vietnam. The arsenal manufactured gun tubes, breech mechanisms, and recoil systems. It overhauled weapons returning from the field. It ran steadily, not at wartime peak, but at a pace that kept the shops occupied and the workforce employed. Vietnam pulled domestic political support apart in a way that no previous American conflict had. By 1970, the country was not just tired of the war. It was hostile to the military establishment that had prosecuted it. Defense budgets came under scrutiny. Procurement programs were canceled or stretched out. The Pentagon, responding to political pressure, began examining its manufacturing infrastructure with a colder eye than it had ever applied before. The drawdown that followed the Paris Peace Accords in 1973 was brutal for the federal arsenals. Rock Island lost nearly 2,000 jobs between 1974 and 1978. The workforce dropped below 6,500 and kept sliding. The shops that had run one shift during the Korean aftermath were now running at reduced capacity within that shift. Several specialized production lines were mothballed, their machinery covered in plastic sheeting, their workers reassigned or laid off outright. And something else was happening underneath the numbers. The Department of Defense was beginning to ask whether the federal arsenals should exist at all. The logic of the question was simple. Private contractors, the argument went, could produce military hardware more efficiently than government-owned facilities. Private workers were cheaper. Yet private capital investment happened faster. Private firms could be played against each other in competitive bidding, driving down unit costs. Federal arsenals, with their civil service workforces, their congressionally appropriated budgets, and their institutional inertia, were expensive by comparison. The Pentagon began shifting more and more of its procurement to private industry, and the arsenals began losing work. The 1988 Base Realignment and Closure Act, signed by President Reagan in October of that year, formalized the process. The BRAC law created an independent commission that would recommend military installations for closure or realignment, with Congress required to vote on the list as a whole rather than protecting individual bases. The stated goal was to eliminate political interference in decisions that were supposed to be driven by military necessity and budget efficiency. The actual effect was to accelerate the dismantling of the Pentagon's internal manufacturing capacity. The first BRAC Commission reported in 1988. Rock Island was not on the closure list that year. The second round in 1991 did not target the arsenal either, but the third round, in 1993, did. In May of that year, the BRAC Commission recommended the closure of the Rock Island Arsenal's manufacturing functions, consolidating that work with other installations and effectively ending the complex role as a production facility. The recommendation would have eliminated thousands of jobs and transferred the manufacturing mission to a mix of private contractors and surviving federal facilities. The Quad Cities went to war. The fight to save Rock Island was led by a coalition that included Senator Tom Harkin of Iowa, Senator Paul Simon of Illinois, Congressman Jim Leach, the United Auto Workers Local, that represented most of the arsenal's civilian workforce, and the mayors of Davenport, Rock Island, Moline, and Bettendorf. They organized. They lobbied. They commissioned economic impact studies. They brought congressional delegations to the island to walk through the limestone shops and see what the BRAC recommendation actually proposed to eliminate. Bill Freed, the president of the local UAW chapter, put the argument bluntly in a statement to the commission. You cannot rebuild this capability once you close it. You cannot retrain 12,000 years of collective expertise from scratch. Once these people are gone, the knowledge goes with them. He was right. The commission, after extensive hearings and public pressure, modified its recommendation. Rock Island would not close. Its mission would be restructured. Certain production functions would be consolidated elsewhere, and the workforce would be reduced, but the core manufacturing capability would survive. The modified recommendation was adopted in September 1993, and the arsenal entered the next phase of its long decline, with its existence preserved but its future uncertain. The summer of 1993, before the BRAC decision was finalized, a public hearing in a hotel ballroom in Davenport. 300 people packed into a room designed to hold 200. Workers in arsenal jackets standing along the walls because the folding chairs were all taken. A retired machinist named Harold Kirchhoff stepping up to the microphone during the public comment period. He is 71 years old. He started at the arsenal in 1942 at the age of 20, machining components for the M1 Garand rifle during the war. He worked 43 years on the island before retiring in 1985. His father had worked at the arsenal before him. His son works there now. Harold stands at the microphone, unfolds a piece of paper, and reads a statement he has written in careful block letters. He is not a public speaker. His voice shakes at the beginning. By the end, it does not. He tells the commissioners that his family has given 3 generations of labor to that island, and he asks them to remember, before they vote, that closing the arsenal would not just end a federal installation. It would erase a kind of inheritance that cannot be replaced by any private contractor. The commission voted 2 weeks later. Harold's statement was quoted in the summary report. It took a retired machinist, reading from a piece of paper in a hotel ballroom, to articulate the argument that the Pentagon's own cost analysts had been unable or unwilling to make. Institutional knowledge is real. It has value. And once it is gone, no amount of private investment or defense contracting can rebuild it. But the 1993 reprieve did not save the arsenal from the deeper pattern. It only slowed it. Through the mid-1990s, employment continued to decline, even without a formal closure decision. The workforce dropped to roughly 4,500 by 1996. Additional rounds of BRAC in 1995 did not target Rock Island directly, but the broader policy environment continued to shift production toward private contractors. The end of the Cold War, marked by the dissolution of the Soviet Union in December 1991, had reduced overall defense spending and eliminated the strategic rationale that had sustained the arsenal system through 4 decades of Cold War budgets. The arsenal's leadership, recognizing that the old model of federal manufacturing was politically unsustainable, began exploring ways to adapt. Public-private partnerships, commercial work performed under federal supervision, technology transfer agreements with defense contractors. The goal was to keep the shops active and the workforce employed by any legal means available, even if it meant fundamentally changing what the complex was. In 1994, the arsenal's manufacturing operations were formally reorganized under a new designation, the Joint Manufacturing and Technology Center. The rebranding signaled a strategic shift. Rock Island would no longer be primarily a federal arsenal producing military hardware on government account. It would be a contract manufacturing facility, competing for work from across the Department of Defense and accepting commercial contracts to fill the gaps. The shop stayed busy. The workforce held, for a while, around 4,000 civilian employees. The federal government can be just as ruthless as any private equity firm. It just moves slower, and it uses nicer words. and the people making the decisions never have to stand in a hotel ballroom in Davenport and explain themselves to Harold Kirchhoff's son. The Joint Manufacturing and Technology Center opened for business the way federal bureaucracies open for business, with a ribbon-cutting ceremony, a press release, and a mission statement full of words that did not quite mean what they appeared to mean. The JMTC would be a working capital fund operation. It would compete for defense contracts against private industry. It would accept commercial work to fill the gaps between military orders. It would operate more like a business and less like a traditional arsenal. The rhetoric was borrowed wholesale from the private sector, and the logic was borrowed from the consulting firms the Pentagon had been paying for most of a decade to explain why government manufacturing was inherently inefficient. The JMTC did what it was designed to do. It kept the shops active through the late 1990s and into the early 2000s. It produced weapons mounts for armored vehicles. It manufactured gun carriages, repair parts for artillery systems, specialty metalwork for every branch of the armed services. It took on commercial contracts where federal law allowed, building components for railroads, for municipal water systems, for heavy industrial equipment. The workforce stabilized, for a few years, around 3,800 civilian employees. Then the pattern asserted itself again. The attacks of September 11, 2001, pulled the United States into two overlapping wars that would last longer than any conflict in American history. The invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, the occupations that followed, the insurgencies that ground on year after year, all generated new demand for specialized military hardware. Rock Island responded. The arsenal produced gun mounts for armored Humvees. It manufactured turret components for the new generation of mine-resistant vehicles. It supplied weapon stations for the MRAP fleet that the Pentagon purchased to protect soldiers from roadside bombs. Employment climbed modestly, up to roughly 4,200 by 2007. The 2000s surge never produced the kind of full-scale mobilization that had defined the earlier wars. The conflicts were fought by a professional, all-volunteer military. The domestic economy was not converted to war production. Most of the specialized hardware came from private contractors. Rock Island got its share of work, but the arsenal was no longer the central node in the supply chain that it had been in 1918 or 1943. It was one manufacturer among many, and the competitive pressure from private industry never let up. When the wars wound down, the workforce reductions returned. By 2014, arsenal employment had dropped to roughly 3,000 civilian workers. By 2018, it was below 2,600. The 2005 BRAC round, which had closed dozens of military installations across the country, had spared Rock Island, but had consolidated additional tenant commands onto the island, changing the nature of the workforce without growing its manufacturing core. The island now housed the 1st Army Headquarters, the Army Sustainment Command, and various support activities. The military population on the island increased. The civilian manufacturing workforce continued to erode. The island was busier than it had been in decades by some measures. The shops that Rodman had built were quieter than they had been in 100 years. The contracting out pressure never stopped. Every defense authorization cycle brought new proposals to shift work away from government-owned facilities. Every efficiency review recommended reducing the arsenal workforce. The arguments were always the same. Private industry could do it cheaper. Private industry could do it faster. Private industry was more flexible, more modern, more responsive to market signals. The counter-arguments, the ones that had persuaded the 1993 Bracey Commission, were harder to quantify. Institutional knowledge, strategic independence, the ability to produce specialized weapons without depending on commercial suppliers whose priorities could shift for reasons that had nothing to do with national security. Instead, the numbers that the Pentagon tracked were the numbers the Pentagon cut. Employment at Rock Island in 2020 was approximately 2,400 civilian manufacturing workers, down from the 20,000 who had worked there during the Second World War. A reduction of nearly 90% over 3/4 of a century. Some of that reduction reflected real productivity gains, Modern machining equipment allowed one worker to do what had required 5 a generation earlier. Some of it reflected genuine changes in what the military actually needed to produce, but a substantial portion of it reflected a deliberate policy choice, made over decades, to hollow out the federal arsenal system in favor of private contractors whose political donations and lobbying presence made them more visible in Washington than Harold Kirchhoff's statement had ever been. The Quad Cities absorbed the decline the way communities always absorb this kind of thing. Slowly, and then all at once. Housing prices in the neighborhoods nearest the arsenal softened through the 1990s and stayed soft through the 2000s. Small businesses that had depended on arsenal workers lost customers. The Saturday morning breakfast crowds at the diners in Rock Island and Moline thinned out. The streetcars had long since been replaced by buses, and the buses ran less frequently. The shift whistles still sounded, but fewer people heard them over the freeway noise that had come to dominate the riverfront. In October 2019, the Arsenal announced a round of civilian workforce reductions that would eliminate approximately 200 positions over the following 18 months. The reductions targeted specific shops and specific specializations, including several of the machining operations that had been central to the Arsenal's artillery work for over a century. The announcement was made quietly, through official channels, without the kind of political fight that had accompanied the 1993 BRAC recommendations. The affected workers were offered early retirement buyouts, transfers to other federal positions, or severance packages for those willing to leave government service entirely. A machinist named Richard Vance was one of the workers affected by the 2019 reductions. He had started at the Arsenal in 1982, trained as an apprentice under foremen who had themselves been trained during the Korean War era, and spent 37 years working the heavy machinery in Shop M. He told a reporter from the Quad City Times that the hardest part was not the loss of his own job. He had hit his retirement eligibility years earlier. The hardest part was watching the younger workers, the men in their 30s and 40s with mortgages and children in school, trying to figure out where they would work next. There is not another Rock Island, he said. What these kids know how to do, they learned here, and nobody outside these walls can use it. His statement ran under a photograph of the old stone shops, taken from across the river, with the late autumn sun lighting the limestone gray. February 2020. Early morning, a weekday. A workforce reduction is underway across several shops. A man named Thomas Edwards is cleaning out his locker in the changing room adjacent to Shop D. He is 46 years old. A machinist by training, a father of 3, whose oldest daughter is a junior at Rock Island High School. He has worked at the Arsenal for 19 years. His father worked there for 31. His grandfather worked there during the Second World War. He is folding his coveralls and putting them into a duffel bag. He has accepted a position at a private manufacturing firm in Bettendorf that will pay him roughly 80% of his federal salary, with fewer benefits, no pension contribution, and no institutional stability beyond the current contract. He zips the bag. He closes the locker door. He walks out through the shop entrance one last time as a federal employee. The stone walls that have stood for 153 years do not change. The man walking past them does. The Pentagon's own analysis, published in a 2021 study on the Defense Industrial Base, acknowledged what the Arsenal's advocates had been saying for 3 decades. The federal arsenal system had atrophied to the point that certain military production capabilities could no longer be sustained domestically without significant new investment. The study recommended modest increases in arsenal funding and a renewed emphasis on preserving institutional manufacturing knowledge. The recommendations were partially implemented, partially ignored, and largely overtaken by the next round of budget priorities. Rock Island entered the mid-2020s with roughly 2,200 civilian manufacturing workers, the lowest number in its peacetime history since the 1880s, operating in a complex that had been built for 10 times that workforce. The shops that were still active ran well, The work that was still being done was being done with the skill and precision that the arsenal had always been known for. But the shops that had gone quiet stayed quiet. And nobody in Washington seemed to know or particularly care what the silence was going to cost the country the next time a crisis arrived, and the country needed arms faster than private industry could supply them. On a Friday afternoon in the autumn of 2023, the last foundry operation at Shop M was shut down for the final time. The shop had been pouring cast iron components at Rock Island since the 1890s. The furnace had been rebuilt 4 times over the decades, the ventilation systems upgraded, the pouring platforms modernized, but the fundamental work had remained the same for 130 years. Molten metal into sand molds, finished castings out the other end, gun carriage brackets, breech components, specialty parts that required the tolerances that only a dedicated foundry could deliver. The man who walked out of Shop M that afternoon as the senior foundry foreman was named Daniel Reeves. He was 58 years old, with 34 years at the arsenal behind him. He had started in 1989 as a 24-year-old apprentice, learning the foundry trade from men who had themselves learned it during the Vietnam era. He had trained 3 generations of workers under him before the foundry was shuttered. On his last day, he locked the cooling shed, signed the final paperwork, handed his credentials to the shift supervisor, and walked across the compound to the parking lot. He stopped once, turned, and looked back at the building. Then he got into his pickup truck and drove home.